Okay, we've got a few more minutes until we get started with today's Be the Change webinar. Our presenter today, David Buggs, is going to be presenting on the end of outreach, recognizing unmet conservation audiences. We've got a few more minutes until 12 o'clock by my clock, so I'm going to hold off on getting started with official introductions, but as we've got a number of folks already joining us, if you guys will introduce yourselves in the chat room and what Master Naturalist chapter you're associated with, or what part of the state you're coming to our webinar from. It'd be great to get to recognize where our audiences are today. Again, this program, as with all of our Be the Change events, are recorded. So if you do have to step away, or if David has some material that you want to revisit on a later time where you can really focus in on some of the great questions that he's going to be posing and the challenging conversations that he's going to start with us today, the recording will be posted on our website by either later today or early tomorrow morning, and we'll be sending that link out to everybody who is registered for the event. So again, we've got just another minute or so before we get started. All of our resources, recording, and the resources, the questions that David has shared with us will be available on that website that Michelle is going to drop into the chat here shortly.
So Mary, can you still hear me?
Yes, sir, I sure can.
Okay. All right. So
and that is the lunch whistle bell in my hometown, small town, Texas. We've got a big old lunch siren, and I live close to the water tower. So that is my cue that it is 12 o'clock noon Central. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with today's Be the Change. Thank you guys so much for being here today. We have an incredible speaker, David Buggs, and we'll introduce him here in just a second. But we always like to run through a little bit of a tech check for all of our attendees today. Don't worry, as an attendee on our WebEx event today, you cannot unmute or share your video, and that is on purpose. We have a lot of attendees today, and we want to make sure that we're able to give David the floor to be able to share his resources and his information today. We do have the chat room open today, so you can use the chat for questions, and I'll show you that in just a second. If you can see my mouth moving, and you can and you cannot hear me, you can see me moving my lips, but you cannot hear me, you're going to want to check your audio connection, and I'm going to leave this up here for just a little bit so that hopefully those folks who are having audio issues can get that solved using these easy steps: going to audio connection, checking your speaker, make sure that your speaker is turned on and the volume is turned up, and that you have the right speaker selected if you have multiple speaker. And then we're going to use chat today, as I mentioned. The chat function is a way that we can all have a conversation in the WebEx room today. There's a couple of things that you're going to want to check out with your chat. If this is your first time using chat in WebEx, you're going to want to toggle. You'll see where it says to and ... My screenshot says host. You're going to want to toggle and make sure that it says to everyone on the list. And that to everyone is a way to be able to talk to everybody else who has joined us from across the state today. Our chat is going to be available throughout the conversation, and if there are questions posed in there during David's open discussion time, or when he stops and asks if there are questions, Michelle and I will moderate those and ask those that we are able to ask verbally. Please use full and clear sentences for your questions. All discussion in the chat must stay on respectful and professional boundaries today, even though that we are going to be having some difficult conversations and hopefully enlightening conversations that David's going to kick off with us today here shortly. So on topic and professional.
Mary Pearl, just 1 second before you move forward on that. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about many of the participants don't have the everyone available as a chat option. If you could check the settings, please.
Yep. I'm going to have to check the settings when I stop sharing my screen, and so I'll do that here when I hand the rights over to David. So I'll do that here in just a second. With our WebEx, we do also have a help center call number and website for anybody who's still having issues. So on the chat, I apologize, that's an issue that I need to fix, and I'll fix that here in just a moment. All right, so getting us started with the Be the Change. Our presentation today is titled The End of Outreach, Recognizing Unmet Conservation Audiences. This is part of our two-part series, our TMN Tuesday event, which is our year-long advanced training seminar series that vary on topics seasonally. They're held on the second Tuesday of the month from 12 to 1 p.m. Central. Our next event is on May 11th. And then a subset of our TMN Tuesdays is our Be the Change series, which is diversity inclusion topics. We're working to build a playbook, and Michelle's going to talk about that here in just a second. And our next Be the Change series presentation is going to be held on May 18th, the third Tuesday of the month, and that's going to be from 12 to 1 p.m. Central. All right, and as we get started here in just a moment, our Be the Change webinar etiquette. Again, attendees are not able to unmute during the WebEx event. Please use the chat, which I'm going to fix here in just a second. Chat function is open for on-topic discussion only. Please be professional and respectful in all comments and questions. This session will run for a little over an hour today. I think David's got an hour's worth of conversation, and then we will hopefully have time for an extra 20-30 minutes of Q&A today and discussion. So we may run over that hour just a little bit today. And then again, we do have WebEx resources on our website if you need more help there. All right, Michelle, would you like to introduce our speaker today?
Sure. So I'm so excited to introduce to you today our speaker. We've been meeting with David since the beginning of the year on this diversity series. And our last meeting, it just came very apparent that David needs to speak next. And so David Buggs is our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And he's been with our agency for a few years now. His main focus at the agency is his main role with us is developing and managing the execution of Texas Parks and Wildlife diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, which includes and extends to programs like our Texas Master Naturalist Program, as Parks and Wildlife is a sponsor of our program, along with AgriLife Extension. David he's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Texas Parks and Wildlife. He also served a similar role with FedEx previously. David comes to us with many areas of involvement in diversity and inclusion and equity, but the most current of the time right now, he's a current board member with the Texas Audubon Society, with another organization that is investigating and continuing the conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their membership and chapters nationwide. He's the current management board vice chair for conservation, diversity, and inclusion for the joint venture. He's the current diversity and inclusion committee co-chair for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So at the national level, there is an association that works with all of our state fish and game agencies nationwide. And they too are looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And David is the co-chair of that committee. And he's the current chair of the Minorities and Natural Resource Committee for that same organization. On the next slide. And one of the things David is assisting us with and will guide us through for his topic today too, is the development and implementation of what we're calling a strategic guidebook or playbook for Master Naturalist chapters. So through our series, our diversity, Be the Change series, diversity and equity and inclusion series for the Master Naturalist Program, we're developing a playbook for our chapters. We envision this as being a living document, focusing on the goals and action items that chapter and conversations that chapters and other natural resource organizations can take to help increase diversity in their membership, within their programming and their conversations, and helping to increase the diversity and equity in their programming for outreach and events in the communities that they reach. We've asked our speakers to share discussion topics, questions, action items, and resources for this document. And as we move through our series, this will be included and added to the document that lives online right now. So it's a living document. It'll be updated as we receive additional information all the time. And with this Be the Change series and the document, we are building towards a capstone workshop tentatively being held in the spring of 2022, which would be for our Master Naturalist chapters and other natural resource organizations who want to implement these resources, strategies, and conversations locally. So with that, David will be leading us through some of those resources, the conversations, and the information to get us started. So David, we'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. Very excited. Thank you, Mary and Michelle, for the great introduction and for inviting me to come and participate. You know, I do so many of these things till I think folks get tired of hearing me, but I don't mind doing them. But you know what that old saying is, a prophet is not always respected in his own hometown, but every once in a while I'll give it a lick. So let me go ahead and get started. There's a lot of information that I wanted to share with you all, but I recognize there's no way that I can share everything with you. Now, someone tell me if you're able to see my screen.
Yes, sir, we sure can. Looks great.
Fantastic. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this subject. And they mentioned a playbook. Now, one of the things, if you've ever played any organized sports or anything like that, or even if you played singular sports, you always have different things that you do at different times, but you recognize whatever the opponent is, you have to adjust what you're going to do to suit that particular opponent. And that's the same way it is when we start talking about diversity and inclusion. It's not a one size fits all. There are a lot of things that some organizations are doing that may not work for what your particular group is doing or where you're particularly located. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So let's get into this. So the first thing that I wanted to share with you is something that you all are very familiar with. And it talks about Texas Master Naturalist Volunteer Program and how it can help children and adults in your community learn about Texas resources. And I thought that was excellent. That's an outstanding statement. And later on in there, it says, in return, you will provide your community with volunteer services in the form of education, activities, projects, and demonstrations. Now, first of all, this is great because one of the best ways to get this information out is through the folks that are already in those communities. So let's talk about that a little bit. So first of all, and just 2 or 3 questions before we really get into the meat of this. First of all, and I want you all to actually shout this out in the chat, and hopefully I can see what's coming out in the chat. The first question is, why is it important to learn about natural resources, the natural resources of Texas? Anybody?
David, we're getting some responses to that. So we can protect it, to advocate for conservation, to know about and understand what's around us, a shared responsibility to use and to protect.
Great.
Because we can't live without them.
Super. One more. Anybody?
Teachers' respect for what's there.
That is super. I'm loving all this. All right, here's my next question. How would the natural resources Texas benefit if each community had TMN volunteers? What are some of the responses? You guys going to have to help?
Some of the responses are to be informed stewards so that they can share about the community. To naturally have more advocates, to become ambassadors of conservation, to educate and to lead, educate our youth about the need for and care for our natural resources, to get information out to the community. Oh, I like this one. Arouse excitement,
Wow, I like it. I
appreciate
like it.
nature.
Great. All right. So this is good. I'm really enjoying it. So here's my next question. Last question for right now. What might be the future effect to Texas if only a small number of communities care about natural resources?
If y'all want to drop your items in the chat, we
Okay,
lose it
Texas.
all.
Okay.
Literally disaster. Continued greater habitat destruction.
Uh-huh.
We could lose the resources and not have them protected.
Huh?
Loss and unrest. There are a lot of loss, devastation, increasing inequities, not protecting the environment, a disconnect from the environment, a low quality of life,
Wow.
lose appreciation for what's around us.
All
We
right.
would fragment even more than we already have, and already have it, than what we already have divided in culture.
All right, so that's enough, and we could probably go on with that conversation, and that's really good. I'm glad that everybody can see that this is very important work, and it needs to be a part of every community in the state of Texas. Am I right? And it sounds like I am, based on what you all said. It's not what I'm saying. I'm thinking. It's what you all said. It's very important to our state. So let's look at the state of Texas. So when we look at the state of Texas, this is our demographics from 2019. So we see that across the state of Texas, and first of all, Texas has been what they call a majority minority state for almost 20 years. Now, first of all, to me, that's kind of an oxymoron, majority minority. We won't get into that right now. It's a totally different conversation. So we look at the demographics across the state of Texas. So Texas is 41% white, or what we call white in the U.S., almost 12% African American, 40% Hispanic, 5% Asian, and then we have some other demographics across the state of Texas. And that's pretty cool. Also, this is something else that I found out about the state of Texas that I also thought was pretty cool. Texas is 51% female. You think about that for a second, because we make a lot of assumptions based on who we see that are leading different things. But Texas is 51% female. Also, here's something else that I found out that was really cool about the state of Texas. Texas mid-range age demographic is around 35, 36 years old, which is actually one of the youngest demographics, mid-range demographics in the South and in the West. That's really cool. But one of the things, the benefits we have is we have a lot of jobs in Texas, a lot of careers in technology and so on and so forth. So a lot of younger people are coming to Texas. But when you start looking at these overall numbers, we look at the ages between 0 and 18, it's 27% of our state is between 0 and 18. Then another 26.1% between 35 and 54. Then we've got other big, large swaths. But we see a lot of folks that are either very young or in that mid-range. Now, actually, one of the things that's the fastest growing age demographic in the state of Texas is between the ages of 26 and 30. Now, it's about 13%, but it's growing fast because folks are moving to the state of Texas. So we're looking at a much younger demographic. So we're talking about a lot of diversity, talking about a huge swath of our state are female, and they're young. So let's look at Texas Master Naturalist membership. So when we look at our age of our volunteers, we look over to what we currently are, 2018. One of the things I noticed that, you look at this graph, there are a lot of folks that are on the upper end of this graph. I won't say what the upper end actually says, but I'm just going to say on the upper end. Well, I'll put it this way. When we start looking at the majority, the age range, and this is 2018, it may have shifted a little bit since then. We're looking at folks that are predominantly between 49 to 77. Now, this is your information. This is not my information. This came from you all. So we're looking at a bit more mature group. Also, when we look at the ethnicity of the folks, this is 2020, active program members. You know, we know what the state of Texas looks like, but now look at the demographics of Texas Master Naturalists. Interesting. Also, when it comes to gender composition, you know, we saw that, you know, Texas, and this is cool, Texas is 51% female, but when we look at Texas Master Naturalists, it's a little closer to 60%, actually probably a little more than 60% female. So my question is, are we a reflection of those different communities that we say are very important to share this information across the state of Texas? Pause for effect. So here's the premise. When we start talking about natural resources, it's very important. We all stated that earlier, that natural resource conservation is and will always be key to enriching the environment, enriching the people, also enriching the economy. And Master Naturalist volunteers have done a great job providing education, what we're currently calling outreach, and other types of management services to those different communities in certain communities across the state. Now, we're facing a lot of things, and we're going to talk about a little bit of this later on. We've got a lot of environmental shifts going on, shifts in how people recreate, how people engage in the outdoors, and so on and so forth. And we got to help, as we said earlier, it's important for us to be on top of this and help and guide some of that. Otherwise, it could spell disaster for our natural resources. So one of the things that I encourage you all to do is take actions to promote diversity and inclusion. So we become increasingly, and what we do becomes increasingly more important to all of the people across the state of Texas, and to help out our economy and help those natural resources, because our demographics has changed dramatically, like I said, over 20 years. And the question we've got to ask ourselves, have we changed and adjusted to that demographic? Not to lose the current folks that we have. We still want the folks that we currently have, but what we're looking at is, how do we go about adding to what we already do? This is not a zero-sum game sort of thing where if somebody else wins or somebody else gains, then we lose. That's not the way this works. This is an added value proposition. This is about bringing in other viewpoints, other perspectives, and other communities so that we can all benefit from some of the things that we're trying to do. So let's talk about these other communities. First of all, we all came from an agrarian background. We all did. Every one of us. I mean, when you start looking at our demographics, and I looked this up a while back, in 1918, Texas was only just a little less than 15% urban and a little over 85% rural. So the majority of us, even some of those folks that migrated here from other places, came from some of those rural areas, and they had an appreciation for nature, had appreciation for outdoors and conservation and everything that you saw out there. And there's some history that I've done on different people from different backgrounds and how they contributed to what we call natural resource conservation. It wasn't just one particular group, it was people across the diaspora of demographics. I mean, we can just think about Native Americans across the state of Texas. First of all, what a lot of folks don't know, Texas had the largest number of varied Native American tribes of any state. There are 11 initially, just in the state of Texas. Now, right now, there's only 4 Native American, what we call nations that are really recognized by the federal government, but still some of these other tribes are still a part of the state of Texas. And we have one of the largest populations of Native Americans in the U.S., in the state of Texas. Also, when we start thinking about our past and how we got started, and a lot of things that were developed when it came to natural resource management, in the state of Texas played a huge role in developing some of these areas. They did surveys, they helped with landscaping in different areas. One thing that a lot of folks don't know about Buffalo Soldiers, they were our first park rangers. Look it up, I promise you, look it up. They were our first park rangers. So they played a key role. Also, here's something else that I want to share with you all that a lot of folks don't know about the state of Texas. Our Asian population is the fastest growing demographic in the state of Texas. It's not the largest right now, but it's the fastest growing demographic in the state of Texas. And guess what I also discovered about our Asian population? They have a distinct intrinsic appreciation for the outdoors. So think about that. When you start looking at the diaspora of folks that are a part of the state of Texas, we all have an intrinsic appreciation for nature and the outdoors. You can go to any urban area across the state of Texas. You're going to find some place where maybe a building used to be, something was there before, where the people in those disparaging different neighborhoods have actually created some type of landscape there. And they're doing some kind of, I promise you, I don't care where you go, you are going to find this. So it's in all of us. There was a survey that was done not long ago by DJ Chase Group called the Nature of Americans survey. And I encourage you to go out online and take a look at it. There's a lot of really good information. One of the things that Texas Parks and Wildlife did, we actually got them to do one just for the state of Texas. And they brought back some information that is extremely beneficial. And when we start talking about the benefits of nature, when we look across the different demographics, we saw that every demographic group felt that there was a very high importance to nature within our lives. It was extremely important to us. Also, when you start looking at, and this is across race and ethnicity, Texas adults see an interest in nature as enjoyable. And again, across demographics, very high. Everybody has that appreciation for the outdoors. But one of the things that it also stated was there was still a gap between their interests and the efforts and abilities to engage in the outdoors. Also, there was information that told us that their experiences in nature were deeply social. That means when they engage in nature, they don't just go out and do like, a lot of times we do that, diehard nature lovers, we go out and want to go out by ourselves. They take folks with them. They take family members with them. They take friends with them. Now, there's some other reasons that I won't get into right now. That's a totally different discussion. Why folks go in nature in groups. And part of it has to do with safety, but not safety because they are afraid of flora and fauna. It's safety because they're afraid of who's out there in nature. But again, that's a different conversation. We won't go there now. But we've got to recognize that access to nature is a little different for everybody. And it's important to everybody, but it's a little different for everybody. And here's the beautiful part of that is that's okay. It's okay. We'll get to that a little different, but we engage in diverse ways, but it's okay. So I put this slide in here because I did a presentation not long ago, and I had some folks that says, well, but we've got to get folks hunting and fishing and all that kind of stuff. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that not every group has a continuing hunting heritage, but everybody has a connection to nature, and we need to be mindful of that and never forget that. And this is something I put in there. I actually put this in there yesterday because I started thinking about this more and more. One of the greatest benefits that we have in the United States is our diversity. And people diversity is a social resource that we cannot afford to ignore. There's huge benefits there. So let's talk about some of the things that we're facing, some of the changes that we're dealing with. So there's, again, we talked about this earlier, changing demographics, there's mistrust in government, there's climate change, there's urbanization of society, and right now, a lot of folks have recognized that just in the state of Texas, now, across the U.S., we're like 82% urban. This is across the U.S. This is recent data. 82% of the folks living in the U.S. live in urban areas. Just in Texas, it's a little over 85%. So we're more urban than the national average. So urbanization is another thing that has changed. Also, there's a lack of protection for our outdoor spaces. Folks are looking at commercializing. Every time you see a space that's open, folks are looking at how we can get in there with a bulldozer and change it to an apartment complex or some other type of retreat or something like that. There's also what we call and I think it was coined by Children in Nature, nature deficit disorder. That's real because we're competing with so many other things when it comes to activity in our discretionary time. So it's created a nature deficit disorder. A lot of this is going on with our thumbs, and it keeps us from engaging in the outdoors. So that's an issue. And then another thing that's a big change is where years ago, folks were more urban, more suburban, more rural, and they were dealing with the different things that were happening in the outdoors and focus on conservation. Now, because folks have become more urbanized, there's more of a conservation challenge, and climate change has exacerbated that as well. And we've got a lot of folks that we call absentee landowners that have neglected some of the places that they've purchased, but there are things that are happening on those particular lands that somebody needs to be aware of, and we need to think about policies and procedures to help protect some of those things. But because you don't have a constituency that is pushing our legislators to focus on those things, a lot of that's going to get neglected. So we've got a lot of different things that are happening. Another thing, and this is big in my agency, is we got a lot of those baby boomer scientists, and they're getting ready to retire. A lot of them already have started. We've had some of them retire in the last few years. It's mind-blowing. And here's the other side of that. They're retiring, but when you start looking at it statistically, the growth of natural science professions is actually slower than the growth of other occupations. So that's another challenge that we have. So I have another question. So based on the things that you just heard, and I want you to kind of put this in the post because I want us to just kind of throw this out there, get everybody talking about it. What challenges to natural resources come with these different changes that we just talked about? Just kind of tweet that out there, or not tweet it out there, put it out there. I'm still not social media savvy. So put it in the chat and all that kind of stuff. And Michelle, if you don't mind, give me a little help. Just kind of share some of the things you're seeing.
So one of the things is urbanization leads to no farms, no food, lack of understanding and respect, taxpayer and voter support for conservation and restoration of natural places, competition with the economic growth.
Anything else? One or two more.
Environmental justice becomes a greater problem.
There's a few that have come into me: loss of connectivity of habitat, loss of advocates or champions, rising costs of land, huge need to educate folks, loss of attitude of value towards natural resources.
Oh, super, super. So we see all of the things that are happening around us, and change is constant. What do we say, that there's one thing that is constant is change. So it's these things are happening all around us. And then when we start talking about making sure that all these communities are educated about the value of natural resource conservation and maintenance of our natural resources, we cannot afford not to have folks in every community like we wanted, like we talked about, you started with, in every community sharing this information. It's critical. It's critical. So how does diversity and inclusion add value to conservation organizations? Well, it attracts and retains new talent. Nope, went the wrong way. It also helps us effectively communicate what conservation means, because a lot of times we assume that everybody knows what we mean when we say natural resource conservation. So it will help us to have an effective conversation around what that means. Also, it helps us with innovation when it comes to how we create programs, how we service different areas. It increases the value of conservation to constituents, expands cultural understanding, larger group support. It also helps us, and this is something that I think folks are starting to get, it also helps you with funding. There are a whole lot of organizations that just aren't aware, but once they become aware, they don't mind providing financial support and other types of support. It increases participation. Also, you get political influence because elected officials are going to vote for whatever their people that put them in office say they want to vote for, because they want to stay in office. Also, and this is something that's huge, and this is something that Fish and Wildlife agencies are focused on now, it helps create that relevancy. Relevancy means that there's this, whatever you're focused on is important to me, not just only to me, but there's intergenerational appreciation for it. I'm going to pass it on. So it starts with us making sure that those different communities are engaged in what we call education of conservation, around conservation and natural resources. So we know that something needs to change. We don't need to just rehash the mantra, well, we've got to do something different. We got it. We know that. So what's the problem? Because, I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. I know this is my third presentation with Texas Master Naturalist. So what's the problem? All right, here we go. So we say that some of our perceived barriers are, well, we've got budget issue, we don't have enough funds to make this thing work, or we can't get enough folks to participate on the committee, or maybe we just don't know how to do this work. So, we just can't make it happen. Well, I'm going to say this with you, and bear with me, because I like to push the envelope just a little bit and get you a little uncomfortable. But work with me. I'm not doing this just to make you uncomfortable. I want to make you think. So here's something I share with a lot of groups. It says, it's difficult to solve a problem until you acknowledge that you are a part of the problem you're trying to solve. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But I just want to throw these things out there. This is, in order to do this work, we must constantly be mindful of our personal and cultural expectations. We're expecting folks to be just like us, our predispositions, our ethnocentricities, how I see other groups, or assumptions I have about other groups, our egocentricities, that it's all about me. I ran into that out there. I had an opportunity to go out to the Grand Canyon and sit with a group, National Park Service and other organizations, and they were talking about inclusion in conservation. And I actually had one person to stand up and say, well, I don't know if I want all of these people trampling all over my spaces. Think about that for a minute. And the last one is, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some things that are very high level: defensive emotions. Because in order to do this work, there's going to come some discomfort. There's going to be some fear, but you got to get beyond that to really do the work. So let's talk about this for a little bit. This is a quote from somebody by the name of Ruth Benedict. And I encourage you, if you've never heard of Ruth Benedict, go out and do a little research on Ruth Benedict. She was active, and she was born in 1887. She's very active in the early part of the 19th century. She She was a fellow at one of the Ivy. I think it was. God, I can't think of the name of the university now, but she was a fellow. She was one of the first females to be made a full. I forget what you call it when you're a teaching partner and they make you the full whatever it is. She was over the anthropology department there, and she was very brilliant. Wrote a lot of early information on race and culture and how culture affects how we see other people. Very brilliant young woman. But she said something that I thought was very important. She says the crucial differences which distinguish human societies and human beings are not biological, they are cultural. They're cultural. So let's examine that for a little bit. And one of the things I want you to know, first of all, you play a role in influencing your culture. We may assume that we don't, but we do. And the starting point of cultural awareness, we've got to have this cultural awareness in order to change this and actually do this work, is becoming self-aware, recognizing some of those things about yourself that may be hindering you from doing the work. That's why I gave you that list earlier about some of those different isms, those the egocentrics and all of those kind of things, because sometimes the reason we haven't done this work is because of us. Think about that for a second. Because of us. So you've got to become self-aware in order to do the work and do it well. Otherwise, it becomes just an exercise. And we don't want this to be an exercise. We don't want to just impress. We want to impact. So we've got to make sure that we, first of all, there's a statement that the young people say, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Well, it's not quite that deep, but we want you to make sure that you're self-aware before you start trying to do this work. So let's talk about something that you should have gotten some information on. It's called cultural agility. So what is cultural agility? Cultural agility is having knowledge and understanding so you can effectively work with people that are not just like you or part of your particular social group or your particular tribe or kinship. Cultural agility is being adaptive and recognizing that everybody is unique and being open to things that you might not necessarily encounter on a regular basis, because as she said, the issue is not biological, the issue is cultural. So allowing other cultures to share their perspective, and that's going to be hard for some folks, because this is the way we've always done it. And I've heard that mantra a lot since I've been working in this conservation space. This is the way we've always done it. My question to you is, how's that working for you? Just asking the question. So the other thing is recognition that you're going to have some conflict. This is not going to be easy work. You are going to have some conflict, because anytime somebody tells you that what you've been doing may not necessarily be the best way, when you just believe what you've been doing all these years has been the best way because it's working for you, you're going to struggle with that. But being open to hear that and finding out what else can we do differently. Also being willing to experience a personal shift in perspective, because all of this is a lot of this is about our perspective. So I have some questions for you. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to pull out a sheet of paper. We're going to go through this quickly, and pencil or pen, and we're going to take a real quick test. And the questions I'm going to ask you, we're going to help determine whether or not you're culturally agile. Now, we're going to score yourself 1 to 3. 1 is saying, no, not very much. 2 says, yeah, I'm getting there. And 3 says, yeah, I'm on top of it. 1 to 3. 1, 2, and 3. All right, you got it? All right, everybody ready? If you're ready, give me a thumbs up. If you know how to do that. If you don't,
Say they're ready.
I'll assume everybody's nodding their heads. All right, we ready?
Yep.
All right, so here we go. First question. When I work on a project, I prefer to work with people from different cultures. Now, grade yourself. 1, 2, and 3. 1, not so much. That's not something that I really want to do. Two is, well, I do it, but you know, it really doesn't matter. Or three, yeah, hey, I'm always looking for those different perspectives. And next question, if conflict arises with others outside of my culture, I'm open to different views. 1, 2, 3. Next one, when it comes to knowing how to cope with cultural diversity, others would say, not I would say, others would say, I'm very knowledgeable. Now the next one, in my spare time, I choose to learn about other cultures. 2, 3. Next question, when conversing with someone from another culture, I deal successfully with ambiguity and differences. I'm okay with that. Last one. In my daily life, I change the way I interact depending on the cultural, and it's culture behind that picture, cultural background of those in. So I'm going to give you a second. Score yourself. Score yourselves. Now, we only got 6 questions. So if you come up with a 6, we need to have a different workshop. But if you, I usually say if you a 10 or above, you're on your way. You're on your way. But now if you around 9 or less, then there probably needs to be some questions. Now, you know what the perfect score is 18. Perfect score is 18. I've never had an 18. If somebody, as a matter of fact, if somebody gives me an 18, I might question whether or not they're being very truthful with themselves. I mean, we had to go back to that quote that's in this slide. But if you're around 10, that's good. If you're around 10, that's good. So hopefully everybody is somewhere in that vicinity. If not, we'll be back for a different session. All right. So let's talk about how you get started with being culturally agile. So how do you become more culturally agile? Well, here's something you can do. And I think you have some of this information. If not, we'll make sure that you get it. Become comfortable being uncomfortable. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Let me unpack that real quick. Become comfortable being in a position where you're not in control, where you don't have the last word all the time, where you have to listen to somebody else's opinion and you're not the person that's sharing everything. Stephen Covey said it like this. First, being understood. Trying to understand before being understood. Trying to understand before being understood. Being uncomfortable, being uncomfortable. All right, the next one is being honest with yourself. Because here's the thing. We all have biases. I think something that Michelle and Mary shared with you all is something that I gave them called the implicit bias test. If you go out to Harvard and just go Project Implicit, it'll take you out to that test if you haven't done it already. And you can find out what some of your biases are. But recognizing that you have them will help you. So when you get into certain situations or around certain people or certain cultures, you can recognize, you know what, I've already prejudged certain things. So let me take a step back and clear my mind and think about how I'm engaging with folks. The next thing is be curious. If you're not inquisitive about other cultures, other backgrounds, other people, if every time you go somewhere, the whole conversation is about you, you're not going to achieve inclusion. So you got to be curious. Be open to other ideas, different viewpoints, what different folks' needs are, because you've got to also recognize needs are contrived from atmosphere and where they are. I mean, you may go into some neighborhoods and you start talking about trees. What they need is clean water. Or you may be interested in flowers and butterflies, pollinators, and they just might be interested in how do we stop getting all these weeds that are taking over our area. So make sure that you're listening to what other folks think are important, their viewpoints, and also some of their assumptions. And you got to be intentional. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. This can't be the flavor of the month. This can't be something that you do or you start because some other folks are doing it. And if it works, it's great. But if it doesn't work, oh well. Intentionality says that if it doesn't work well the first time, I'm going to find out why it didn't work and make the adjustments and go have a conversation with folks about what I can do differently. That's what being intentional is all about. You've got to also be a champion for change. You can't wait on somebody else to step out and then join the bandwagon. You got to push this as well. Also, you got to be authentic. People can sniff it out when you're inauthentic. When a lot of things that you're sharing is contrived or you're just going through the motion, folks will sniff it out quick. So you've got to be authentic. And you can't be afraid either. Because I think it was Bill Russell that says all decisions made out of fear are bad decisions. So you got to be courageous. So being intentional, it's about getting started. I like this quote from James Baldwin. I actually use it in a lot of things. It says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So you got to be willing to listen. Not only listen, but you got to make sure that you're including other folks that may have a different perspective than you. As a matter of fact, seek those folks out. Because if you fill up a room and you call yourself listening, but everybody that's in the room is just like you, well, what are you listening to? Because it's going to be the same stuff. And you can't make new changes with the same information. So you've got to make sure you're being inclusive. I'm going to move a little quickly. I've got a couple more slides I'm going to hit. But one of the other things we've got to be careful of is that we don't develop something, and this is something that we've always done in our society. We'll come up with a great idea and we'll say it's for everybody, but only invite a small group of folks to develop it. And what that does is it creates a barrier because those other folks have had no input into developing what this thing is that you say is for everybody. So we've got to make sure that we're inclusive in anything that we develop, in programming and whatever it is. A good friend of mine who I'm actually trying to get to come and share with you all by the name of Mickey Fern says, we can't use our values to understand and motivate people whose cultures, lifestyles, and choices have emerged from different cultures and systems. That's very important. Carolyn Finney, who is someone I've had the pleasure of hearing recently, she wrote a book a few years ago called Black Faces in White Places. She talked about this work called outreach, and she says outreach has to be reciprocal. There has to be a give and take in order for the relationships to be sustainable. She says there's no universal story. My experience with nature is going to be different from yours. And you shouldn't try to force me to assimilate. And that's something else that I want to just hammer on just a little bit. Well, I won't hammer on it. I've just pointed out, we've got to be careful that we don't bring folks in so they can just do everything just like we've always done. They're going to do it a little differently. And you know what? It's okay as long as the end result is education. As long as the end result is the maintenance of our natural resources. It doesn't matter. One of the things that I struggle with I sat in on a group with the National Forest Service. They actually brought in some interns from some of our Native American schools. And they were talking about different activities they were engaged in, but they had problems with the way that they were going about doing it. And the Native American students were trying to tell them, we have been doing this for thousands of years. Our ancestors have passed it down to us, and it has always worked. Just because it's not exactly how you want to do it, or we're not tracking the data like you have, doesn't mean it's not going to work. So be open to it. Recognize that there are many roads to get to the same place. So again, she talks about examining your biases. And I like this last thing she says, here's the thing, here's the bottom line. Do you want to be comfortable or do you want to be better? I thought that was kind of profound. All right, so, and there's a familiar face to some of you all. This work is very complex. It can be nuanced, but one of the things you got to do is start off setting clear goals, recognizing there's no silver bullet. There's not a one-size-fits-all. You got to make sure that the organization comes along with you on the journey. It's not just 2 or 3 folks that are crusaders. Listen for feedback, both internally and externally. It's very important. Listen for feedback. And here's the other thing that I think is very important. Don't marry your plan. If you develop a plan, you got to have a plan, but don't marry your plan. Just date it. Because from time to time, you're going to have to make some adjustments. And if you're married to it, you're going to have more anxiety than anybody in your organization. Don't marry it. Just date it. It'll be okay. And be okay with changes. And I like this saying, in the absence of a clear plan and effective communication, what happens? So let me ask you this before I go to the next slide. I'm almost done. What happens when you don't have a clear plan and effective communication? Just throw some things out there to chat.
The first couple, people say nothing.
Yep. Good answer.
The program withers away. Doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
You get lost in the woods.
Yep.
Zero growth.
Yes.
And failure.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So you get it. You get it. I don't really have to go through this list, but you get it. But that's what happens when you don't have a clear plan. And here's the other thing that I want everybody to be to kind of wrap their heads around. Be careful about piecemealing approaches. And when I say piecemealing approaches, just throwing some stuff together, again, with no plan, just pulling stuff together. You start treating things as an afterthought. You fail to connect with the organization and with the mission and goals of your organization. Now, here's one that I throw out to a lot of organizations, and I tried to make it larger, but my box didn't change with it. Trying to replicate best practices from others, even when it's evident that it won't work for your organization. So be careful about best practices. Will it work? Do some evaluation. It might be a good practice, but is it the best practice for you? So look at it from that perspective. Even as you all go through these different conversations, make sure that that you're attaching yourself to, it may sound good, but will it work for you? All right, and some questions to ask yourself. Is this important to our mission? How really inclusive are we today? What progress are we making? What should we stop doing? And that's another real good question. What help do we need? Because sometimes you don't have everything inside of your organization to help you move the needle. And what does success look like? And what are those measures that are tied to that? So ask yourself some of these questions. And I'm going to make sure you all have a copy of this as well. And this is something that Stephen Covey says. He says, strength lies in differences, not in similarities. And this is a guy that I've had the pleasure of meeting recently, and hopefully he's going to be able to come and share with you all pretty soon. His name is Alex Bailey. He has a group called Black Outside. He's down in San Antonio. But here's something I want to share. It says, courageous and compassionate conversations are a good start, but they shouldn't be the end. And speaking of the end, I'm almost close. This is something else that I encourage you all to do. Bringing folks in is great. But if they don't stay because the environment is toxic, or they aren't able to be included, they can't share their perspective and opinion, they're not going to stay. So while you're working on the outside, you got to work on the inside. As a matter of fact, I would even encourage you to start working on the inside before you bring folks in from the outside. So you got to do both. You got to do both. You got to work on the recruitment piece, but you also have to work on the retention piece. And that being said, any questions? I've got a lot more stuff, but I'd rather us talk about that at a different time. I'm going to share the slides. There's some other questions that are beyond this, but any questions from you all? And I'll stop sharing.
David, not a question, but a great plug. You just mentioned Alex Bailey. We just had a conversation and are able to confirm that Alex Bailey will be our Be the Change speaker on our next month's event on May 18th at 12 p.m. Central. And we'll be sending that information out shortly.
Great, great, great. Anything, throw it out there. I'm open to all of it. I know
Yeah,
Go ahead.
There's a couple of questions coming in the chat, and one question, Lynn asks, do you have a place to start?
Yes. Yes. And that's a great question. Here's where you start. You start with you. I know that's a loaded one. You start with you. You start asking yourself, why is this important to me? And the next thing you ask is, why is this important to our agency going forward? And don't just think about the narrow thing. Think broadly, not just for the right now, but for the future. If you can't recognize your why, then it just becomes another nice thing to do. You got to recognize your why. That's why I started with those questions I asked you on the front end around engaging the community and why it's important to engage, to share all this information in those very communities. You got to start off with that why, because if it's not personal, you're not going to do it. I mean, that's who we are. That's the way we as humans operate. There has to be some something personal in it in order for us to not only just do it, but to do a good job. So you got to start with your why.
So a follow-up question to that, David, that we're kind of getting from a couple people in the chat is, how do they make that initial reach out? How do they connect with a group in the community? What tips can you provide to members interested in doing that?
You know, and I get that question a lot. And actually, I have, on the rest of these slides, I actually have some organizations that we work with that I'll share with you all. But here's my thing. How do you connect with other organizations that you want to reach out to? I mean, if you wanted to reach out to the Sierra Club, how would you connect with them?
And feel free to add your items in your responses in the chat.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to reach out to Sierra Club or another group, how would you do that?
Yeah. Yeah. Any other organization, how would you reach out to them? I mean, it's the same thing. You know, there's websites, there's phone numbers, there's email addresses for all these types of organizations. One of the things that my folks wanted to do was develop a relationship with Latino Outdoors. We got a huge Hispanic population, and we're looking at trying to increase participation in our state parks. So the question, somebody came to me and says, how do we reach out to Latino Outdoors? I asked them, well, had you gone to the website? They says, yeah, there's a website. I said, was there a number there? Yeah, there's a number and an email address. Okay, call them. Tell them what you want. Tell them what you're trying to do, and then listen. I mean, it's not any different than any other organization. The thing that becomes the problem is you're concerned about what they might tell you, or if you're going to say the wrong thing. If you're authentic and you really want to develop a relationship, that's what you say. That's what you say. That's all you have. It's really not as hard as we think it is. The hardest part is overcoming us. It really is. The hardest part of it's just like starting any other relationship. You know, I remember when I first started pursuing is now my bride of 35 years. I struggled initially because I was looking and I was thinking, yeah, I want to make that connection, but you know what I did? I walked up to her and I said hi. And that's where we started. And I encourage you to do the same. Just walk up, call, email, say hi. Say, I'd like to develop a relationship with you. I don't want anything from you. And I encourage you not to start telling folks what you want them to do. That's a problem. Says, I want to develop a relationship. And we can talk about some of the other stuff later on. But until you have that relationship, and it's just like any other relationship, until you establish that relationship, you need to just stay focused on, hey, look, I'm just trying to be authentic. I want to learn more about you. Tell me more about you. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely.
What else do you
I
have?
had a question from the cultural agility section of your presentation, and I'm actually going to ask 3 questions that I thought were just so well written. Susan and Lynn and Zoe all asked a question. Susan asked, what if we live in a bubble and seldom interact with people from other cultures? Lynn asked, how do we interact with folks from different cultures? Should we change how we interact with them, or should we act the same and hope that they come to our presentations? And I don't know if I'm asking that one correctly. And then Zoe asked, how do we attract those who score less than 10 on that agility test to trainings like this, or to start the conversations with us?
Well,
And
I'll start.
one more question
go
following
ahead.
up to that. Some people asked, how do we do that in the time period that we're in, like the stay at home and kind of social distance time period that we're in? So that's the here and now spin to that question too.
Okay, so I'm gonna address those in no particular order. First of all, the less than 10 folks. Some of them are not gonna change. And you need to come to grips with that it is what it is. There are some that they are who they are. And you know what? That's okay. Work with the folks that are trying to become more than 10. Work with the folks that says, you know what, I'm struggling, but I really think there's some positive things that could come out of this movement. Work with those folks. And hopefully some of those folks that are less than 10 will see the transformation and see the value there. And again, always focus on the value. And they will ask that question about what I can do differently. But start off with the folks that may be less than 10, but want to get beyond 10. Start off with that. As far as engaging folks that are outside of your circle or your bubble, I mean, it comes down to how would you engage anybody else who's outside your bubble. One of the things that I learned I used to work for a company called Sabre Holdings, which was a part of American Airlines. And I was the manager over supply chain diversity for them for a long time. And I reported to the senior vice president of corporate strategy. And I was having issues getting some of our VPs. They were doing a whole lot of nodding and saying, yeah, we need to do this thing around engaging women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and all. Yeah, we really need to be on top of that. But nothing was happening. And I was about to quit. True story. I was about to quit. I was on that point. I actually went into my senior vice president. I says, and his name was David also. I said, David, I'm about done. This is for the birds. These people will not change. I don't care. And he says, David, I understand. He says, but here's the thing you got to know. People do, especially if they're in a position of any kind of power, they do what they want to do. You got to find out what they want and tie that to what you're trying to do. So you got to have those conversations, but you've also got to get outside of your own self. If you don't want to get outside and be a little uncomfortable, it's not going to happen. And you can't just create something and assume everybody's going to come to you. How did you come the first time? You didn't just show up. Somebody invited you. I had the same question when you did the statewide session, and I did a presentation then. I had a guy that got up and said, you know, we've got a website. Why don't these people just go out to the website? Well, if these people don't know about the website, how they can get there? Sometimes somebody has to invite them. Somebody invited you, right? And he says, yeah. I said, you got to do the same thing. Just put the invitation out there. And don't put the invitation out there with saying, here's what we want you to do. Put the invitation out there that says, come and tell me what you think about it. And start from there. Just invite folks. That's the way you get outside of your bubble. You don't have to have a long conversation, because I know there's a lot of folks that are concerned about having a conversation because they think, I don't know where folks are getting this stuff from, but they think they might say the wrong thing. Well, if you go out and you're authentic and you say, hey, look, here's what I want. I just want to know. I want to get to know you, and I want to be able to share something about me with you. Folks, listen to that. Everybody's open to that. Everybody's open to new things. But you've got to listen, you know, in order for them to listen. And there's going to be some cases where you're going to have to just share some things with them to let them know where you are. You know, just open up and says, here's who I am. I don't know. And it's okay not to know. I know we like being in control of everything. It's okay not to know some stuff and be sincere about it. But that's how you learn. And the last one was, give me that last one more time. I think I may have answered it, but help me with that last one.
It was Lynn's question. Lynn was asking, should we change the way we interact depending on the culture of the people, or should we just act the same with everyone? That question is still difficult.
Well, and I will say this. If you change the way you interact, are you being authentic? Think about that. If you change the way you interact, first of all, if you're trying to change the way you interact without somebody saying, hey, can you make some adjustments? You're going to do something that you don't actually have a good understanding of how to do. You know, I'll never forget. I was at a corporate retreat when I worked for FedEx, and I had a guy that he just felt he wanted to get to know me, and I actually had a speaking part at the retreat talking about some of the things we were doing, because I was also over part of the philanthropic part of FedEx office. And he decided he wanted to come, and he started using language that I knew wasn't common to him. You all know what I'm talking about. And then he tried to do some stuff with my hand. I mean, he slapped me and all of that. And I just stood there and looked at him, and I asked him, what was he doing? And he says, brother, I'm down with. So long story short, I really didn't want to be around him anymore. Because he wasn't being authentic. He was trying to be something that he was not in order to gain something I wasn't willing to give him. So be who you are, but be honest. If there's something you don't know, say, you know what, I don't know, and here's what I'm struggling with, and here's what I would like for you to help me with. Just be who you are. Now, that being said, don't go in trying to change them to be who you are as well. Now, that's the other side of that. The assimilation is not the key, is not the answer. Let them be who they are, you be who you are, and then you learn from each other. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. All right. What else? What else you got? I like this. This is good. I saw a flash. I couldn't read it. It was too fast for me.
I'm looking through the questions.
So David, I have maybe I guess a follow-up question for my own that I have personally. You said the last thing you said, it said be who you are, but be honest. And then the other note I wrote was,
Unless being dishonest is who you are, then. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm joking. I'm kidding.
oh, the other note I wrote was, but also allow others to do the same. What happens, or what would be maybe your course of action if the like the example that you gave, the other person being honest and who they are just wasn't like you're morally right, like what they were just it they didn't align with your thoughts, and what next?
If they're being who they really are, I can respect that. I don't have to agree with it, but I can respect that. And that's the important thing that we've got to wrap our heads around. One of the things, I actually did a presentation for CFOR, for Southeastern Fish and Wildlife Agencies. They asked me to do a presentation on political correctness. Now, I think there was an assumption that I was going to come in and talk about how to be politically correct. And some of them were not happy with my answer because I basically gave them an example of what it was, talked about the history of it, and then said that I thought it was the biggest setback for all of us, whether you're conservative or whether you're liberal, all of that. It's a problem because nobody's being authentic. But what we all can be is respectful and recognize that we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different perspectives. We all see things differently, and it's okay because it's your perspective. I mean, who am I to come in and tell you that you're wrong when that's who you are? But you basically invalidating me as a person. That's a problem. But I will tell you, you know what? That's an interesting perspective. It's not my perspective. I have a different one. You know what? I respect your point of view. So let's talk about that third space where we do agree. Let's find out where that one is. And I encourage you to do that. Find that third space that you do agree upon. Don't harp on the stuff you disagree upon. That is and I see folks doing that all the time. That is the most fruitless conversation you could ever have. It drives me bananas. I mean, why are we even talking about this? Let's talk about the things where we do agree, and let's stay there and find out how we can move that forward. But if you're not exactly the same, whether it's culture-wise, viewpoint-wise, it's okay. It's your perspective, as long as it's not harmful. Now, if it becomes harmful, then that's something totally different. And harmful doesn't mean you hurt my feelings. I want to put that out there because I get that a lot too, where it hurt my feelings. Well, but those are your feelings. So you have control over whether or not it hurts your feelings. They don't have control over that. They're just telling you what they think or how they see things. Whether or not you take it in the position where it hurts your feelings is up to you. But they're entitled to their perspective because there's some stuff that you might say that might do the same thing to them. But let's get to that place where we're talking about what we call that third space, that place where we agree, and focus on that. You know, I understand. I don't necessarily agree it. I'm not going to embrace it. But here's what. There are some other things that we do agree upon. Let's talk about those. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And I like the fact that you brought to the forefront the idea of respect in the third space. Like we've established that this is what we can't agree on. Let's move on to what we can agree on and work towards.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And believe it or not, it's not as difficult as we think it is. We make one of the things that's great about us as human beings is we are mostly free thinkers. But the hard part about us is we're also overthinkers. Before we meet folks, we go through a whole conversation, a whole scenario in our heads, and it colors the conversation that we have with them once we engage. And when we've gone through what I'm going to say, what they're going to say, how many of us have never done that? Okay, now I know what they're going to say. So here's what how I'm going to respond once they say that. And then when they say this, then I'm going to say that. And then when they say this, that is the most fruitless thing in the world. Now normally we want to anticipate some things, but our objective should be to find out where we agree.
And while you're thinking through how you're going to respond, you've stopped listening to what they're saying.
Exactly. You got it.
I have a great question in chat, and I know we're getting close to the hour and a half mark. So I don't know if this is going to be the last question or not, David, but Emily is with our capital area chapter, and she says, I struggle with finding the balance of trying to address these issues and how they affect us as naturalists, as master naturalists, or as conservation engaged citizens, versus the desire to try and address all racial and social justice issues everywhere. For our Texas Master Naturalist organizations, where do we focus our efforts? So without trying to fix the world, how do we fix what we can, and what our core mission as Texas Master Naturalists are?
That is a great question, and I love that question. One of the things I actually did when I was asked to do this, I went out and started looking at your website, and that was why I pointed out those areas about our community or your community. My focus was not on just trying to make you do all things and solve all things for all people. My focus was on how do we get you to help folks to recognize that, you can't necessarily be the right person to help their community, but they can. Here's some value adds that will help all of our communities. How do we get those folks in those different communities to come on board and go back to their communities and start educating the folks in their communities about these different things? And it's going to be different versus every community. We're not asking you to solve every issue around discrimination. Just focus on how do we develop relationships. That's it. It's real simple. When we start talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not about numbers, and this is something I tell my organization also. It's not about head count. It's not about EEO, because everybody is a part of some protected class, whether it's gender, age, race, background, veterans, all of that. Everybody's a part of something that's a part of a protected class, and it's not about head count or affirmative action. It is real simple. It's about relationships. How do I develop a relationship with somebody that's outside of my particular group so that I can learn, I can grow, and then maybe I can share some of the things that I'm doing that might help them learn and grow. It's simple. Don't complicate it. Don't bring any of that other stuff in there. Don't bring any self-help books, all that kind of stuff. Everybody knows how to develop a relationship. It's just like going out and trying to date somebody. How do you get started? You go and ask the question. You don't go up and just automatically start telling them everything about yourself, because you know what they're going to do? They're going to say, excuse me, I'll be right back, and you'll never see them again. You find out about them. And let them know. I love to develop a relationship with you. Not trying to solve every racial issue. Matter of fact, I encourage you not to do that, because you're going to go down a road that you're going to be totally unfamiliar with, and you're going to be sorely disappointed. Just focus on developing those relationships. And there are a lot of organizations that are already out there. And I mentioned Latino Outdoors, Outdoor Afro, Black Outside, Outdoor Asian, all those. There's a tremendous number of organizations out there that are already doing some of the work. What you want them to do is see how you can help each other. Make it as simple as possible.
And then just together marvel at the natural world that we live in. I feel like at the core value of Master Naturalists is just that natural wonder of our natural resources in the world around us.
Yeah. I've got a friend of mine that, most folks would look at him because he's been in corporate America most of his life. And, he didn't grow up in like a rural area or go engage with a rural area like I did, he was thinking, everything outside, beyond the city limits is for somebody else. So a few years ago, and it's been a little while back, he actually got a chance to go to Yosemite. Never been to a national park, anything like that. And they took him up on, and I can't think of the name of it, where you can overlook the fall, the waterfall. And he called me and he told me, he said, David, I cried. I cried. And he said, it touched me so much till I couldn't, I was overwhelmed. And he was trying to do that macho thing, but he said, because it was like there was something that was in me that was calling out, and it was calling out to me. That's in everybody. It really is. Our objective is to bring them in, or to go and engage with them and find out what they're already doing. If they're not doing anything, but they have an interest, just kind of share, hey, here's some possibilities. Not telling them what to do. Here's some possibilities, and then help them, once they develop that relationship, that same kind of level of relationship, say, don't keep that to yourself. Go tell somebody else. And I'm going to use the term, somebody's going to probably beat me up behind this, but it's okay. That's just my perspective. It's sort of like the gospel. Once you find out what it is for you, then go tell somebody else about it. But personal thing. It's not going to be just, got to do it my way. It's going to be personal to you, but let them know the benefits of it. That's what this is all about. So everybody can have that same level of, or a certain level of appreciation, and provide the protection and the maintenance that is part of us as people.
Yeah, maintenance is important, and maintaining and constantly revisiting your kind of place within the larger framework of what we're working towards. In the last 5 minutes, David, I wanted to put the spotlight on the other folks that are on our panelist group today. Kelly Simone and Tanya Hamayan have joined us from Texas Parks and Wildlife. And then Addison Regeneter, our student worker and an almost master student, she'll graduate here shortly, is also on the call, and all of them have been crucial in pulling this Be the Change series together. So if I can put them on blast just a little bit to see if Kelly or Tanya, if y'all have any questions or comments that you want to add on these last couple of minutes, things that you want to hear from David after today's presentation. Or Michelle, if there's anything else that you have that you want to add in today.
Yeah, I just have one question, maybe to throw back at our attendees online today. What's the first thing you're going to do after this presentation? And you can drop your answers in the chat. So I'm seeing a couple answers. Be more open-minded, more discussions with board and chapter members, encourage members to view this series, read about the Buffalo Soldiers and other organizations, take the Cultural Agility quiz, pause before speaking, start looking at websites and reaching out, think about different perspectives or new perspectives, share this with my chapter members, see whether other groups exist in my area.
And go outside. I like that one. Well, David, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate all of your resources that you shared, and I'm going to drop that link into the chat again. Today's recording, and then all of the resources that you shared. And if there's anything else that you want to send along, David, we'll post it to our website so that everybody has access to that there.
No problem. Thank you all for inviting me. I enjoy this. I don't know if you noticed, I might have a little bit of passion around, just a little. But if anybody has any questions, I don't mind asking it. They can go through you guys and direct them to me, or you can send them to me directly at david.bugs@tpwd.texas.gov. I get questions all the time, so I don't mind addressing them. I also encourage you, a lot of folks are not familiar with Ruth Benedict. I encourage you to go out and do a little research on her. She's pretty interesting, way ahead of her time. So go out and do a little background check on her as well. But thank you all for your time. Thank you for listening to an old man rant about diversity and inclusion. And anything you all need me to do in the future, don't hesitate to ask.
Well, David, we want to thank you for your passion in bringing that to us today. It was excellent, and the comments in the chat are echoing that sentiment as well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, and with that, I'm going to get our presentation closed up today. I'm going to share our next Be the Change event is going to be on May 18th. We have confirmed a speaker, and we'll be sharing more details about that presentation as it gets closer. But Alex Bailey with Black Outside will be our May 18th speaker. Again, all of the resources that we shared, that David shared today, the recording from today's event, and registration for future events is all going to be posted on this website. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month.